It is such a treat to be joined by all of you, and I'm so happy to see everybody connecting with one another. Before we start the next segment of our program, Jennifer, I just want to say thank you again. It was such a treat to dive into the art upstairs. So thank you for setting us off on such a nice foot. And there will be opportunities for everybody to spend more time upstairs in the exhibition as the day unfolds. And I also want to say that everybody is invited to join us for lunch today. We have wonderful, wonderful food here at Bowdoin. So after our next talk concludes, please join us if you wish. We'll escort you across campus to our dining hall where we will be able to continue the conversation. We are absolutely delighted to welcome our next speaker, who joins us from the United Kingdom. Thank you so much, Sonia, for making the trip to be here. Sonia Bayhoun is Professor of Literature and Film and the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of Essex. Her work will soon appear in print in her forthcoming book, Modernism and Home. There's so much more to say about Sonia, like our other distinguished speakers, so I will refer you for more information to the speaker biographies. But for now, Sonia, a warm welcome. Thank you for being with us, and we so much look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, I hope everyone can hear me well. And thank you so much for this fantastic opportunity, for this invitation, for being able to be among the like-minded and the like-enthused people. So I'm really, really privileged to be here. And of course, thanks to Bowdoin College for sponsoring this trip and this talk. You see the title of my talk, Selective Perspective. Mina Eloy, the homeless and the economy of discomfort, and it will follow very closely on some of the last remarks Jennifer has made while she was touring us, and I'm so grateful also for that wonderful contextualization. And I'll plunge in medias res because I feel that you are all well primed for us to do so. I'd start with a temptation to obscure the material reality of homelessness and destitution, what Mina Eloy once described as the hueless overcast of downcast countenances, a pervasive feature of the early 20th century thought and art production on home. This temptation remains with us today. It's easier to explore poetic wanderings or loss of homeness in a globalized world, or indeed to make TV shows where the slum life is presented as an action-packed curiosity, than to acknowledge that the number of people in inadequate housing today across the world is greater than at the beginning of the 20th century. Some artists of the first half of the 20th century did address these experiences directly, summarizing their affective registers in poignant texts. In my forthcoming book, Modernism and Home, I label these articulations punctums. Now, the punctum I want to focus on today is a disquieting series of poems and artworks Eloy produced while living in increasing obscurity in the Bowery in the 1940s and early 1950s, very early 1950s. It would be untrue to say, of course, that in her lifetime, Eloy herself did not partake in both exaltation of vagrancy and efforts to resolve what Georgi Lukács called transcendental homelessness. And we've heard a little bit about her devotional practice. Yet I'd like us to remember that she was also deeply troubled by the easy slippage into abstraction. For Eloy, unlike many other modernists, happened to have personal experience of inadequate housing and destitution. Visually and symbolically darkened by the L subway line that ran across it, when Eloy moved close and within it, the dilapidated subsector of New York City called the Bowery hosted a sizable population of impoverished, stationary, homeless, and dispossessed, memorialized in Abbott's photographies, one of which you have here. How did it all come into being? The number of people traversing the US in search of work and temporary abode grew steadily in the second half of the 19th century, and clustering of jobs in big cities meant that they would move to metropolitan centers. Once there, they would mix and mixture in a crowd in distinct urban zones. They are mixed with impoverished new immigrants, and together they formed a cohort that started to conceive of the city or the city streets themselves as their home. To those with permanent abodes, this population, variously referred to as homeless, transients, hobos, or bums, appeared to embody the exact opposite, the property of the modern city to be homeless, and thus also the capacity to generate homeless subjects. For a limited time, this transient subjectivity was a source of fascination because it appeared to present homelessness as the converse of the traditional construct of home, marked by the ideal of kinship and locational permanence, and Loy herself was one of these rebels who saw it in these terms. But the popular perception of the figure of homeless changed dramatically in response to socioeconomic shifts and the rise of urban ethnography, basically when we learned more about their living conditions, real living conditions. So when Loy wrote Hot Cross Bum, a poem from 1949, bums had already been deprived of any romantic allure. Conducting the first censuses of urban homelessness in the 1932 and 1933, Nels Anderson defined a homeless, or a bum, not as a poetic or political hero of the new era, but more mundanely as a destitute man, woman, or youth, either a resident in the community or a transient who is without domicile at the time of enumeration. Such a person, he continues, may have a home in another community or relatives in local community, but is for the time detached and will not or cannot return. This definition opened a can of worms out of which poured the following questions. Is homelessness an individual's problem? Character flaw, failure in one's personal choices, or psychological pathology, or is it socially constructed? What exactly counts as being homeless? Is it only absolute minimal homelessness, those who had been unable to pay for shelter of any kind and spent the census night in public shelters or outdoors, or a wider range of temporary residents of open dormitories that Jennifer described, or philanthropic cheap hotels, or cheap lodge houses as Loy frequented? These questions would be also on Loy's mind when she moved to the Bowery, the area that hosted progressively fewer vagrants and more static, long-term unemployed, often disabled population of down and outers, averaging over 50 years of age. I remind you, for those of you, that Loy fits perfectly in the age constellation there. The Bowery group dominating the public eye were single men, stereotypically seen as disaffiliated from family or other types of social bonds, but as the location of the city's only municipal shelter for women at the Bowery suggests, the area was actually home to a lot of vulnerable women and homeless families as well. This limbo-like space radiated misfortune. The Bowery inhabitants included an increasing number of alcoholics, drug addicts, and patients released from psychiatric wards, as well as those catering to them, a range including religious missions, public shelters, soup kitchens, pawn shops, tattoo parlors, sex workers, men's hostels, retailers of alcohol, and drug smugglers. The Bowery inhabitants lived in rooms in cheap lodging houses, Skid Row hotels, or open dormitories, or warehouses, nickel-priced spots, as we call them, or increasingly sleeping rough on the streets. They were sporadically aided by welfare services, local churches, and organizations such as the Red Cross, the Catholic Worker, an important one for Mina Loy, and the Salvation Army. And while homelessness decreased across the US in the late 1940s and early 1950s, it remained prevalent in the Bowery. The mental image of Loy in the Bowery one tends to conjure is that of a broke, grumpy old woman with hoarding habits, a kind of sidewalk saint, occasionally starving, occasionally telling tales or sharing drinks with her neighbors, who scavenges the back streets of the Bowery in her nightgown and accumulates trash in her room of a cheap lodging house. She's intensely aware of her aging body and her aging clothes. She explores the textures of poverty, for she is seer. Of the trash, Lois is particularly enamored with egg cartons, banana peels, mop heads, and flattened cans. Sometimes these items linger in her barely walkable room for no particular reason. Sometimes she makes them into curious assemblages, collages, that some of which you have seen. Sometimes she observes these transient objects in their relative position to the transient human subjects around her and writes a poem, piles it in a sequence with the working title Compensations of Poetry, or else stores it for now, scant possibility of publication. Why does she do that? Rachel Potter suggests that Lloyd regarded her enforced expatriation as a form of homelessness, too. And Amy Morris points out her disaffiliation from sanctioned social institutions, a kind of move in her from her being liberated to being frustratingly impotent. Interest in homelessness may be a natural stage in Lloyd's progression as an artist, I suggest. She was a long-time believer in the individualized collectivism, a brand of collectivism that issues from an individual's determination to create an artistic space for social reflection, as exposed in her manifestos like International Psychodemocracy, also on show. And she was always interested in the idea of failure and fringe figures, objects, and phenomena. And it was an inspiring aesthetic challenge. Lloyd was aware of the high ethical states of representing and discussing homelessness and was unsatisfied with the majority of previous treatments. In the Bowery artworks, she programmatically rejects both sentimentalized and orderly naturalistic depictions of homelessness and quizzes the varied public and artistic discourses on the homeless. Finally, she seems to have believed in creative, intellectual, and spiritual bonuses of engaging with destitution. Impoverishment clarifies vision, she assures us in the refrain of On Third Avenue, the first poem in the Compensation of Poetry series written at the time. Such are the compensations of poverty: to see. Lloyd referred to her Bowery work as réfugié, a term which connotes refuse, and to refuse, and refugees, and also refuge, or to offer refuge. This description is telling of both the content and the dynamics of her Bowery years' production. Made of perishables and meant to be perishable, many of these assemblages have perished. She herself abandoned them when she moved uptown, eventually outside the city. Only a fraction survived, and you know that story well. Many of Lloyd's poems and stories have also perished, and almost all of her work from that period that survived focuses on the states of destitution and deprivation, engaging the forms at the margin of what the ideologically habituated eye sees. What Lloyd terms our selective perspective, our capacity for denial, for deciding what we want to see and what we do not want to see. By the way, the term is also Melanie Klein's, a psychoanalyst, and for those in psychoanalysis here. So what does she engage? She engages dilapidated housing, rags, heaps of trash, a homeless woman resting in the foundation corner of a department store, probably the best criticism of capitalism I've ever seen. An overworked seamstress, a ticket seller imprisoned in a box office, a straying nun, a mentally handicapped child clutching to a fire escape staircase, a drunkard copulating with the pavement, pigeons whitened by their excrements, and varieties of odd flowers, cyclamen, dandelions, petunias, surrounded by urban grit and grime. Just like her Bowery artwork itself, the subjects Lloyd puts up for our ethical and affective cogitation are marginal, perishable, transient. Some of them seem to harbor potential to be redeemed or to redeem us through their immanent link with nature and imagination, or through their angel-like ability to transit across the threshold of the material and the immaterial. Yet, Lloyd repeatedly reminds us that hers is neither a resurrection story nor an exalted salvaging of the occluded. Her subject's appearance is emphatic but transitory, and she underscores their ephemerality and lack of durability. Their ephemeral rank may grant them certain freedoms unavailable to those whose position in the socio-symbolic order is more clearly defined, and their transience may cast them as the figures of passage from one world to another. But ephemerality confines its subjects to a vicious circle, and transience connotes disposability. Lloyd's observer is relentless, The eyes of an idiot child are uncompromisingly vacant. The homeless' bodies are infested and obdurately decomposed by parasites, dirt, and alcohol, and the pigeon's irritant song is punctuated by the frequent production of excrements. What is represented on the page and in artwork suggests as much. Lois Bowery work relies on the subject and material of detritus and the particular ontology of trash, which Greg Kennedy has rightly identified as revolving around the question of how materials and human beings have become disposable. How they have, in Mina Loy's words, disappeared before they have appeared. The intimate observation of these indices to disposability both invokes and challenges our capacity for empathy, establishing an interaction that is sympathetic and inimical in equal measure. Linguistically and visually exuberant, these poems and assemblages navigate the terrain of conflicting emotions, affective postures, and bodily reactions attendant to the experience of someone else's home or its lack. So which affects are these? Interest, warmth, empathy, attraction, uncanniness, disgust, contempt, shame, sorrow. I'd like to draw your attention to two testimonies to this project, one poetic and one belonging to visual arts, although as you have got to know me in these couple of days, I very heavily try to defy the division between these two art forms, and so did Loy. So both were produced in 1949 when the new rise of homelessness started troubling New York City officials. The year before the New York Municipal Lodging House was demolished, and Dorothy Day's, an important figure in Mina Loy's life, Dorothy Day's On Pilgrimage was published in 1948, so a year before, and the Bowery homeless population was estimated to be 14,000 people. The Committee on Homeless Men, appointed by the mayor, O'Dwyer, in the autumn 1949, found that demand for shelter far exceeded the supply, overcrowded municipal facilities posed health risks, and an increasing number of the homeless lived 24 hours in the street, sleeping curled in the corners of the streets and avenues. Many of them had a previous history of mental illness and chronic substance abuse, and the Bowery became what at least one commentator referred to as a dumping ground for those whom state health system cannot care for. At the time, Loy lived just around the corner from a Catholic worker house of hospitality on Christie Street, which regularly provided hot cross buns on Good Friday. Loy's long parodic poem, Hot Cross Bum, opens with an establishing shot of the Bowery as both an extension of the city and its underside. Beyond a hell vermilion curtain of neon lies the Bowery. What follows is a relentless representation of the vicious circles of bodily and mental plight in an unhospitable home. Corporeal, excessive in imagery, painfully satiric, and for these reasons perhaps most disliked by scholars. I do like it though. Because programmatically, there is little felt or ascribed compensatory beauty in the images of the subjects afflicted by the lack of material home in this poem. And the scope for spiritual interpretation is ultimately reduced here. We are handed only an uncompromising image of bum-bungling of actuality, where the homeless' bodies are presented simply as bodies, uncomfortable ones. Bandage-footed, flecked with opal bruises of belabored bone, the homeless are presented as lifting so daintily the lusty lies from their uncovered shins, masturbating in the street as they plead that they are choicelessly corrupted, this plea itself being mercilessly ironized, suggesting that the homeless themselves might be blamed for their flight into the artificial elysium of alcohol and drugs. The voice that guides us through the Bowery cityscape accosts a variety of perspectives on homelessness and eventually clusters into two main observing subject positions linked to the two modes of the poem, the narrative and the lyric. Much of the poetic force of the text stems from the clash between the discursive positionality that could be called the poet and the narrator, or the spiritualist and the ethnographer, respectively. And these take affective turns marked by words like still, nonetheless, yet, but they also permeate each other in phrases such as blousy angels or misfortune's monsters. So they have an inconclusive exploration, and they display compassion, aggression, trust, and disgust, and armed with an excess of images, both painfully extimate and unapologetically intimate, they compel the reader to join in this intense, unyielding self-scrutiny. Because no discourse is immune to Loy's relentless relativization of our impulses, noble or otherwise, including to desire to kindle our eyes on the intimacies of those who are less fortunate than we are, as well as the opposite but related impulse not to describe visceral plights of other humans in too much detail, and because the reader must have partaken in one or the other of these discourses in their own lifetimes, Hot Cross Bun is an uncomfortable reading. Now, at one point in this poem, Loy takes up observing in Downsight from Tall Tower. You can see the quote there. It's a perspective which renders the observed subjects both indistinguishable and desperate, lost in a grey dissynthesis, she writes. Subsequently in the poem, she describes the well-trodden pavement as communal cot for the homeless. Later in the same year, Loy lifted up this image of spatial ideological orientation and this phrase and reworked them into an assemblage called communal cot that you have seen upstairs. This is representative of Loy's Bowery art, usually viewed as an interlocutor with Duchamp, with Cornell, but also really, as we have been discussing these past couple of days, an art very much itself, very much of its own. Loy's choice of collage as an art form, as the preferred art form to relate the Bowery realities and surrealities, corresponded well to a range of her lifelong interests and immediate concerns, to Henri Bergson's theory of intuition and absolute knowledge, so knowledge obtained through the act of entering into the object as opposed to encircling it intellectually, pursuit of a feminine expression, dynamics of discarding and retrieving, and search for the roots of access to what was then known as the fourth dimension. So I'll skip a little bit of the context about the collage, because obviously you could have seen it, or assemblage, you could have seen it up there. But I'll tell you that this choice and this kind of practice served at least four functions for Loy. First, it enabled her to extend the Bowery real into the represented with as little corruption as possible by bringing into representation the very materials her subject lived surrounded by and may have handled, in which she herself spent days collecting. So there's this very sort of bodily engagement that all of a sudden becomes a representation. To draw attention to what she called selective perspective, by juxtaposition of the qualities that we tend to ascribe to the materials, these materials used in composition, so their marginality, impermanence, putrefaction, bygone use value, with our image of the homeless as the marginal, the discarded, the outcast, the transient, the degenerate, the bygone use value. Then third, strategically, to implicate us in an intimate interaction with what usually escapes the eye via reinforced hapticality of the assemblage. And here hapticality operates as an uncomfortable extimation, this is Lacanian term, forgive me, extimation of the opaque, occluded or ignored, and a gesture of demanding relation. So basically they are there, that they really force us into relation. And then fourth and most important in this series, to make us rethink our own affective and cognitive perspective through this disorienting play with perspectives and dimensions. These all can be flipped around, and actually on the museum's website, this particular collage appears in a different direction, which I actually really admire. I love that perspective because it does give you a sense of looking down from a tall tower. So all these themes are operative in this assemblage, and you can see it here, 10 figures apparently lying on the pavement, both a group and a series of unliked individuals, clothed in rags in various stages of decomposition, all of them collected by Loy. So what do we do with this one? One might be tempted to celebrate Loy's deployment of urban detritus as an indication of recycling, upcycling imagination. That would be a new interpretation. Reading law in this vein would suggest that a slum, a city, a country, a continent, and the earth itself can be redeemed through an ecologically sound reliance on what it has cast off, and that art's ultimate modus operandi is the perpetual handling, recomposition of found and disintegrated objects. While all of this may be true of her art and her conception of the world, Lois Sharp's focus on the stages of decomposition and cast-off nature of these objects also literalizes the plight of the Bowery homeless in a too emphatic fashion for this interpretation to hold on its own, much as I would like it. So, in this assemblage and similar ones in Lois' opus, the aesthetic eruption of trash indicates, above all, as I suggested, the dispensability of humans and objects in a system that relies on their disposal for its own ordering and operation. We are invited to touch it in order to be touched by it. Words like hot cross bum and communal cot, I suggest, are disquieting because of the simultaneous operation of three distinct planes of affective signification in them. The subjects that are put on display are in discomfort. Their representation incites discomfort in the audience, and the artwork itself obstinately scrutinizes the sources of the observer's discomfort. So it does work alongside these three axes all the time. This layered practice is premised on the belief which Loy articulated in the International Psychodemocracy Manifesto, namely that with the help of strategically activated intuition, we can learn to relate. Now, involving the subjects that challenge our capacity to relate, this effort becomes markedly self-conscious. You can call it an amateur ethnography, articulated through the aesthetic engagement with the economy of discomfort. Its main aim is not only to bring visibility, but also to explore the sources of the artist's and the audience's discomfort and the ideological and psychological strategies we deploy when faced with an image of the lack of material home. The play of perspectives in Communal Cot, about which we have talked a little bit, confirms this interpretation. The scene being composed as if one were looking down on these figures from a tall tower, the viewer soon becomes painfully aware of their own hegemonically held vantage point, a perspectival vicissitude which allows them to look down like a god and read, organize, and congeal in space below into an imaginary totalization. These are the terms by a guy called Michel de Certeau. On the part of the observed, some of the figures seem to aim their vacant gaze towards the viewer. Others appear to ignore the viewer completely, a compositional choice that exacerbates the sense of unspecified responsibility in us, the spectators. What are we expected to do? Do they expect us to do anything at all? Disconcertingly, Loy rotates the plane of artwork to what Leo Steinbeck called the flat bad picture plane. The object that is supposed to lie horizontally has been intentionally presented vertically. The rags, therefore, reach out and not up towards the viewer. The hegemonic position may well be a perceptual chimera then. Instead, we have an equally uncomfortable request for communication. The ragged appearances reach out at us not from the position of seeking sympathy, but from one of ethical demand for interaction. The rotation of picture plane also renders them weightless, nearly material, and engaged in variously ascent or descent, we can say. They might be on their way to being lifted up, not yet angels. Angels do not look us in the face, if you have noticed that about the angels. But no longer bound to physical bodies. Coupled with the figure's motility, their vacant gazes may well indicate that these people are beyond the three dimensions to which we are accustomed. If this is the case, then they are separated from us, viewers, or are just about to be so, as they smile or cast one last detached glance back. But they are not fully transcendent either. The haptic nature of the work, the protruding clothes that invite one to touch and experience them, do not allow us to disconnect from them or to relegate them to abstraction. It is this tension between our separation and connectivity and interaction between austere materiality and insubstantiality that are sustained throughout Bowery production is a lesson. It's a lesson for us. It's a lesson in making art, and if you wish, reflecting on art, that relies on its inherent operation of abstracting reality but not severing the links between artwork and the material realities of both those inspiring and those receiving the artwork. It's a very hard equilibrium to make, to abstract reality and to be part of reality, to represent, abstract, and to be part of it. Three functions that it needs to fulfill. And I invite you to think about all Bowery and other Lois production in these terms. So what actually makes these poems and collages both disquieting and spellbinding is not the subjects they treat, but Lois' creation of an interactive space through which the artwork operates. A space that is simultaneously material, social, spiritual, meditative, and unthinkably intimate. In this talk, I have attempted to reposition our scholarly discussion of Lois' production beyond disciplinary or art form boundaries. I've also attempted to engage a recent materialist turn in our approach to artworks and pivot on the need for renewed social engagement, in turn also adopting a long-span view of engagements with home and its political and aesthetic reverberations across the 20th and into the 21st century in a similar fashion in which Roger invoked very contemporary music to discuss Lois yesterday. Such an approach should also enrich us as workers in culture who take up Lois' mandate. Lois' mandate? Well, yes, Lois does have a mandate for us. At their radical end, Lois' interventions point to the nature of home as a project in which all of us should engage. And it starts around the corner, engaging and listening in the 2 homeless shelters in the town of Brunswick. In this spirit, I would like to close this talk by acknowledging and signposting for those interested a few organizations. Thetford Housing, which manages Brunswick's homeless shelters, Mid-Coast Hunger Prevention Program, which runs a soup kitchen and food pantry, Oasis Free Clinics, which provide affordable healthcare for the homeless in Brunswick, and The Gathering Place, a daytime shelter for homeless people and others seeking companionship, warmth, and food. Thank you.
Sonia, thank you so much for an amazing talk. And I imagine that there will be feedback and questions. And my one request is that in asking questions, people use the mic. We can pass it around to you. Your voice will not be amplified. That doesn't mean that it's not working. It just is required so that we can capture your questions for the recording. So it will enable the camera to pick up your questions and observations.
I have a question. Oh, thank you, Sonia. That was a beautiful presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm just thinking, and this may be just asking you to speculate, but I know that throughout, particularly, I'm thinking about the late 19th through the 20th century in thinking about visual representations of the poor, and I'm thinking particularly about photography, but just real debates about how to represent the poor. I'm thinking about Jacob Riis. I'm thinking about the kind of mandates in the documentary photography organized by the federal government in America in the 30s, which strove to kind of represent the poor in a dignified way. And so I'm thinking about how you talked about the tendency to sentimentalize or romanticize the poor, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit further about kind of like a visual discourse of poverty, representing poverty, that you see kind of coming into your project.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful question, and actually the one that I belabor a lot in an extended version of this talk. I think it's really important for us to think about a period between 1880 and in particular punctum would be 1895, the publication of Riis, how the other, the monograph or the document, the document, I would say, of the era, How the Other Half Lives. And there are a couple of actually similar projects that are equally very important in terms of documenting how the other half lives. I always put that in the brackets or in quotation marks because the half is actually majority. And there is a kind of an ideological steer to this discourse as well. So we start from that moment in time. And at that moment in time, there is still a competing vision of kind of twain, vagrancy, exultancies, the hobos. It's all very exciting and sentimentalized. You have that, but you also have a rising number of homeless in the cities and the rise of a distinct discipline. Nels Anderson, that I mentioned, was at the forefront of rising of that discipline, which we call urban ethnography or ethnography. And so what they did was to go into the city, those crowded, discrete urban areas. So very soon, where we have the segregation of the urban poor in specific areas. Part of that is circumstantial. You know, when you land as a new immigrant into New York City, well, you go to Lower East Side because that's the first where you can land. You don't have money, you don't know where you are, you don't have spatial coordinates, and so the overcrowding of these areas, in a way, started naturally evolving parts of the city into slum-like conditions. So you have a competing discourse then, competing to the previous one, which seeks to capture. But that discourse is also manipulated in the best way you can imagine manipulation to happen, by trying to elicit emotions of empathy and trying to exact the real changes. So we have a lot in the early 1930s, a lot as we move through the 1920s and into 1930s, a lot of municipal welfare projects. And actually the census that I quoted was done in order to inform the Federal Transient Service, a New Deal initiative to actually capture or have some sense of what this population might be going through. It's actually aimed to service that, and all of the photographic discourse aimed to service that. Now, it's a really interesting thing in human nature that once you start looking into poverty, you almost start feasting your eyes on it. And there's this easy slippage that occurred at some point in the 30s, 40s, and then 40s in particular, when you would have a lot of scientists, ethnographers, but also amateur ethnographers or people who were simply curious. Let's go to the Bowery as a kind of source of curiosity. Filmmakers, we have our first Bowery films, and I don't want to say that the films are not a powerful weapon. I don't want to say that the photography is not a powerful weapon in the struggle for social justice. That's not true, but you have also simultaneously this almost exoticization of the homeless and the poor as someone that needs to be helped but is out there, somewhere there. And it's great, to have this other, so that we can actually, when we have money, not always in the 30s we did have money, when we have money we're going to invest a little bit of money and that's going to solve the issue. There is very little structural systemic thinking about how to resolve the issue. So it's an interesting position. And so so following the visuals of the era, you can see them moving from very earnest effort to capture and to record and to actually inform the practice and support to something like a curiosity. And then simultaneously you have various churches and I shouldn't say only Christian churches, really various churches and spiritually informed support that also was helpful, but was also a little bit hypocritical in the sense that it sort of redeemed us too easily, I think, in Mina Loy's term. I'm not saying that I would say one or the other or the third, but in Mina Loy's eyes, I feel that all these sources of redemption and all these visual images and literary representations were actually not good enough, or were missing the point, or were very easily being converted into something different. And has this uncomfortable, running through different perspectives in hot cross buns, I think. That would be a long answer to your very simple question, but I think it's a really important question, because these representations and visuals are with us today. And it's exactly the question we pose ourselves when we see an image of atrocity today, or the image of the poor today.
Thanks, and I would just also add, I love your sense of how things change in the 40s, and I'm thinking too about tabloid photography and the kind of sensationalized spectacle of the poor, as well as
Exactly.
the criminal, as part of a kind of tabloid visual discourse that really begins to emerge at that time. So I really appreciate your tracing through that. Yeah.
Yes, wonderful. Yes, tabloids, brilliant thought there. Worth exploring. Thank you.
To tie together a number of things. All right, it doesn't amplify, that's good. So you mentioned in your talk, which I thought was evocative of the intimacy that Mina demands from us by these works. And then your question provoked, it's interesting, she never, to evidence, picked up a camera. She knew all of these photographers, Levy's making films, but it wasn't her tool. And they are very intimate. Her work was always intimate. Touch was so important to her in her work. And yet in life, I don't imagine someone can share something, that Mina was a real hugger. She wasn't that person with the people in her life. She kept her own space. But in art, she touched intimately, always, all of these people. I don't know where the reference is in her early portraits that it empowered her. I don't know where this is from, but to observe people up close, it gave her a chance to be intimate and yet keep them at an arm's distance. And so in relationship to this topic, so it is a common topic. Is art useful for social change? I'm not sure. Are artists social activists really? Are they accountable in their own souls for their belief in something's importance? And so they bring it to bear in their artwork. And it's a kind of testimony, but it's not marching in the streets. It's not being present. But for Mina, in this body of work, we know that she was up to her elbows in the dirt and the filth to select the work, and then to, with care, render this truth so intimately. And so I really like that you said that they're so intimate that they make us intimately involved. And I don't know whether she did it to affect any social change, but it was her truth. And I again feel that that's, and I was just thinking in her life, where did she, the whole obsession with faces and arms. She was a nurse in World War I, dealing with patients with sheets and just arms and faces. So it was a moment in her life where she was thrown to that. It wasn't in her nature to be connected with strangers, but she did in fact learn that, and whether that's where she learned it. But then it comes to bear, literally, I think, as you aptly said, in this work later.
Yes, absolutely. I think this context, the whole context that you are painting is really speaking to this drive to create intimacy really through creating an interactive zone. And I think you're right to suspect artists they do march in the street, but that's not what primary role of the art is, and they don't exact really the change by painting or very little good art exacts the change by painting something and saying that changing the whole thing. Rather, art works in those indirect ways. And I think for Loy, it was really the creation of a zone that we have to enter, and it will be intimate, but a zone, and it will force us to think and reflect. And that will be this indirect route to social change, I think. And that is why I appreciate this kind of tension in her work that sees her drawing us in, at the same time trying to make something that is also not purely representational. It's not purely, she wants us to feel, to kind of be in the realm of affect and then to work from there. Thank you.
Thank you for that really illuminating talk. I think my question is going to be quite a simple one, asking for you to say more about the Hot Cross Bun poem where you said it was uncomfortable reading. And I'd love to hear you say more about that, because I think all of us who are fascinated with Loy, there's this really strong temptation to see her as a seer and seeker and sage, and to interpret everything that's curious or difficult or unclear about her work as some greater insight than anyone ever else.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And yet I also loved when you said she's always, how did you put it, to represent, obstruct, and be part of reality. She's not always above or outside the problem she's talking about. So can you tell us more about what you meant by uncomfortable reading? Did you mean that it was like deliberately uncomfortable in ways that makes us more informed, compassionate readers? Or are there things about the poems that you're just like, ew, what does that mean? That makes me uncomfortable. Maybe this is problematic.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Very good question, really. The discomfort, the economy of discomfort in which she takes us in, works on two levels. One is the excessive imagery in Hot Cross Bun, which is very effective, very cringing sometimes. It conjures up all these transcendences as well as very visceral plight of those that she is describing. But that is actually not, to me at least, the key source of discomfort. The key source of discomfort is the fact that as you read through this long parodic poem, which I invite those who haven't read it to read, you realize that all these discourses we talked about, none of them is perfect. You just think that the competition between the poet and the ethnographer is so strong. You just want these subjects to be redeemed, and then there is this merciless ironization of your own impulse for them to be redeemed. You then just want to see a bit less of it, to select, to exercise your right to selective perspective. When Melanie Klein talks about selective perspective, says it's a defense mechanism. It's our right not to see everything. We wouldn't endure seeing everything, and yet you are compelled to see everything. And so as you work through the poem, you work through different positionalities and discourses that could help us feel better, either by, we've sorted it, we've splashed $2 million on the homeless in New York City or homeless in Brunswick, as a matter of fact, and we should feel good. And also those discourses that tell us maybe they will be redeemed in the afterlife. And also those discourses that tell us, oh, if I just picture them, if I just record them, I'm going to change it. So every single discourse is invoked and then challenged. And this is why it becomes increasingly uncomfortable as you go towards the end, which I think Loy, with absolute magnificence, also accompanies with ever more excessive imagery of ever more challenging taboo subject as she moves towards the image of the homeless copulating with the street. She's moving us in both directions so that we feel increasingly uncomfortable. And so when we come to the end, we stop. There is this redemptive sort of flare at the end again. We stop and we are left suspended. And we cannot say, oh, thank goodness Mina Loy and I have resolved this issue. We're not allowed to say that. And that's what I meant by uncomfortable reading.
I think we can take one more question. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on Jennifer's comment, which I'd never thought about before, and which I think is really very revelatory for me, that Loy herself doesn't pick up a camera. I mean, she's yeah, and in relation to your, Sonia, your wonderful response to Suzanne's question about levels of discomfort that we find in the poems and in the artwork, I was wondering if you might reflect a little bit on what it is that the camera does that's different from what a poem or a piece of visual art does. So a camera, it gives you a snapshot, as it were, so that momentary fixed image. would you say that Loy is really just not interested in the image as such? That is, she wants something more than what you get from, in a way, more than what you get from simple seeing or just seeing. I'm not quite sure how to put it, but anyway, if you could reflect on that, that would be lovely.
Thank you very much. That's, again, another wonderful, inspiring question. Again, two ways to answer it. I actually do think that she works with camera-like tableaus and images that seem at first to be like photographic images, but she works with them in a way in which, say, early Soviet filmmakers, Eisenstein and the like were doing, which is kind of juxtaposition, images that are fluid, not photography, so juxtaposition of fluid image tableau, stop, montage, next, fluid image tableau, montage, next. And I do think she has, even though she's never picked up a camera, she has this kind of visual imagination in her work. But she also distrusts camera. Camera freezes us, I'm not sure, maybe Jennifer has really more knowledge on this, whether she's ever commented on photography anywhere that you could have found.
Well, photo after pogrom.
Yes, exactly, photo after pogrom. Yes, so that would be a good example. So that late poem, a really, really uncomfortable reading, another uncomfortable reading. It is inspired by a photograph. And it's inspired by a photograph, atrocity photograph, so going back to that idea. But it is also, so at the same time, there is a kind of denunciation of our wish to kind of capture atrocity or capture anything, but also an engagement with that. And I sort of position her in between these two, rather than just saying straightforward, she detests photography or detests visual capturing of reality. I think there is enough evidence in the way she works, both in these. I mean, I think Christ on a Clothesline is a good example. It's a very cinematic assemblage, if I can put it that way, for those who are familiar with filmmaking of the period. Its composition is very cinematic. You can imagine the waving of the body. You can imagine a kind of what they call a long take, so something along the lines of I don't know, Chantal Akerman's filmic practice, where you can focus, I'm invoking Akerman because she's a feminist filmmaker, you focus on something for long enough time that you take in everything and you establish this interactive zone, and then you flip to something else and to something else, and that's what she often does in her poetry. So yes, discomfort with photography, but also an interest in the dynamics of visuals. Yes, sorry, there's a lot of...
I would just as a point of interest, that the unpublished manuscript fragments of Islands in the Air include a chapter where the protagonist, Linda, who is kind of veiled autobiography, is involved with a photographer. And that chapter has a lot of interesting sort of things to say about different modern technologies of vision, including the camera, including the snapshot, including X-rays, and including telescopes and microscopes. So that there's this kind of, I think, real interest in technologies of vision that pervades a lot of her thinking, although she doesn't write directly about it a lot.
That would confirm my intuition, but fantastic. So that's my next reading then.
That's a great source to suggest. I just was thinking of what was Mina's experience of photography. So from the Heuss photographs to the very last photograph of her in her old age, she controls those images. She delivers her self-representation. She's not naive about the fact that photography is a kind of possession. It's taking authority over someone. And so for her, maybe that was never interesting to do to another person, because she understood that was not a free exchange.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
right.
Yes. And I mean, this goes along her merciless scrutiny of all the discourses. Photography has established a particular discourse, and it's a discourse of exchange, as you rightly point out. It's a commodity exchange, and I think we've also passed, in our experiences of photography, we've passed a long way since early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, where photography was a very commercial enterprise for artists in terms of self-representation. So you can think of very varied artists. Konstantin Cavafy, the brilliant Alexandrian poet, is a good example. He curated his entire, persona in these photographies, manipulated the lighting, everything. So I think Mina Loy was likewise very much aware of, what she cashes in for her photography. At the same time, she was aware of the other uses of photography. So yes, thank you.
Thank you all for a very rich discussion. Sonia, thank you for stimulating. Thank you for stimulating such a rich conversation, and thank you for your wonderful remarks. They were fascinating and enlightening. And we're going to just call a pause to this portion of our program and actually take now a little break for lunch, over which we can continue to talk about the many interesting questions that Sonia's paper raised. Thank you so much, incidentally, for so generously reminding us of poverty in our own midst and the ways in which we can act on some of the prompts that Loy gives us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if this PowerPoint presentation is shared, each of these are clickable, so you can go directly to these associations.
Thank you.